American special forces fought against Cuban special forces, and planes and technology from the United States challenged technology from Russia and China. Venezuela donated $500,000 to Donald Trump. The capture of Nicolas Maduro had many nuances, more than many people imagine. This is not a video talking about the motivations of the Americans or other politicians. For that, watch the previous video. The first Saturday of 2026 began with sudden geopolitical changes and the resounding failure of a defense system. Suddenly, Venezuela woke up after a troubled night in Caracas. Those who weren't in the capital only found out in the morning that their president was on a flight to the United States, and it wasn't for a visit. Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, would appear 2 days later for the trial. There were many questions surrounding the operation that would bring them to the American courts. After years of bravado and forging alliances with traditional opponents of the United States in geopolitics, China, Russia, and Iran, these three countries bear a lot of responsibility in this story, much more than they would like to admit. Much of the equipment that Americans had to face in the Venezuelan system was built by Russians and Chinese. Overcoming that barrier, which had been years in the making and could have been improved more, was a challenge. In recent months, since the United States sent part of its navy to the Caribbean to conduct a maneuver near Venezuela, the Americans had an advantage in this. Part of their equipment had already been tested against some of the best Russian systems. Precisely when the Israelites attacked Iran and obliterated much of its air defense using F-35, F-16, and F-15 fighter jets. Now it was time for another test on another terrain, with absurd limitations that the defenders themselves had imposed on themselves and, apparently, were not properly warned about by their allies. A test that, ironically, would have been triggered for an unusual reason. When the Americans began to mobilize the Southern Command, claiming they would start a war against the narco-terrorists based in Venezuela and led by Nicolas Maduro, the world waited, knowing the true motives. However, many were deeply mistaken in thinking that part of these plans involved a ground invasion that would culminate in a war against the Venezuelans. Some predicted another Vietnam or even the fall of the American empire. But amid the explosion of drug traffickers' speedboats and the seizure of oil tankers transporting oil to Iran, Venezuela, Russia, and Hezbollah, there was much more at stake. Troop and ship numbers kept increasing during the initial months. There wasn't enough force for an occupation of Venezuela, and many wondered if the goal would be a full-scale bombing. The Americans put on a show of fireworks and spectacle, but behind the scenes, the CIA was gathering information. United States espionage fully exposed Nicolas Maduro's private life. Elite agencies like the National Security Agency and CIA infiltrated the country to monitor every move of the Venezuelan leader, collecting intimate data ranging from his meal choices to the exact location where he rested, not missing even the smallest details about his pets. Throughout 2025, the United States Air Force conducted bomber and fighter flights near Venezuelan airspace. These operations, deliberately provocative in nature, aim to force the activation of the country's air defense systems. With this, signals intelligence platforms such as the RC-135 were able to identify frequencies, operating patterns, and response times. The flights. The much-reported initial B-52 bombings were, in fact, a trap for the Venezuelan radars. Little by little, the Americans mapped out everything they needed to know about Maduro's regime defenses. The operation's key technological revelation was the use of the RQ-170 Sentinel, a stealth drone created by Skunk Works at Lockheed Martin. It was designed to operate in highly contested environments where conventional platforms would be quickly shot down. Its extremely low radar signature and advanced infrared electro-optical sensors allowed constant surveillance over Fuerteventura and the Miraflores Palace, establishing Nicolás Maduro's patterns of life without alerting systems like the S-300VM or the JY-27A. The RQ-170, unlike satellites, provides more observation, continuous assessment, and can penetrate dense defenses. On the night of the capture, it provided real-time video to the political military command, acted as a data relay node, and carried out immediate post-attack damage assessments. Since the imposition of the arms embargo by the United States in 2006, Venezuela began a radical strategic shift, moving away from its traditionally Western doctrine to adopt a stance based on strategies defined by Moscow and Beijing. The daily anti-access area denial strategy is a military doctrine aimed at controlling access to a theater of operations and the freedom of maneuver within it. The concept of anti-access involves actions and capabilities, usually long-range, aimed at preventing adversary forces from entering the operational area. Area denial, on the other hand, involves means that are usually shorter range, with the goal of restricting the enemy's movements and actions. After their entry, protection was based on the Russian shield and Chinese eyes, building a multi-layered system to impose prohibitive costs on any attacking air force. One of the prides of this arsenal was the S-300VM, acquired as part of an $11 billion Russian arms package negotiated between 2009 and 2013. At the peak of oil prices, the S-300VM was a Russian long-range air defense system designed to destroy ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and aircraft. It had the advantage of being fully mobile. The Russians claimed a range of 200 to 250 kilometers and said it was capable of engaging up to 24 aerodynamic targets or 16 ballistic missiles simultaneously. And that wasn't all to counter whatever the Americans sent. They also had the Bukem-2E, capable of engaging up to 24 targets simultaneously at distances of up to 50 kilometers and altitudes of 25 kilometers. The final layer of the Venezuelan defense was made up of more than 40 systems. S-125 Pechora 2M, another mobile system with radar capable of firing missiles up to 35 kilometers. There were also the European Union 23 anti-aircraft cannons, a Soviet weapon with two 23 mm barrels side by side, firing about 2,000 rounds per minute, which would easily shoot down American helicopters. In 2005, Venezuela acquired JYL, one long-range 3D radars to replace the old Westinghouse ANTPS, 70 radars of American origin. Later, the country purchased multiple units of the JY-27 radar specifically marketed as anti-stealth. It is estimated that up to 9 units of the JY-27 and 12 of the JY-L1 were in operation in 2026, forming the backbone of the national air surveillance. The promise was the ability to detect the F-22 and even the F-35, an aircraft that has been the target of so much criticism since it first started flying. The Americans were able to exploit all the Venezuelan failures very well. By this point, the CIA and National Security Agency already had full knowledge of the human factor, the fundamental basis of most systems. The S-300VM requires highly qualified operators with advanced technical training to manage the spectrum and distinguish real targets from false ones. In Venezuela, the loss of human capital caused by the military careers has led to these systems being operated by poorly trained teams, often conscripts, unable to perform complex maintenance or keep the system running under degraded conditions, especially under cyberattack. The equipment was also doctrinally designed for the vast open steppes of Eastern Europe, where the radar horizon is clear for hundreds of kilometers. Venezuelan geography, particularly the coastal mountain range surrounding Caracas, is a nightmare for long-range radars. The American forces exploited the radar shadows created by the mountains and deep valleys. Meanwhile, the Chinese JY-27 radars were inherently inaccurate. a JY-27. A model from the 2000s could indicate that there was something in a sector of the sky 300 kilometers away, but the resolution cell could be several kilometers wide. That was insufficient to guide a missile. To make matters worse, all these systems were very poorly integrated, and they also sold systems that didn't fit what the Venezuelans needed. There was another factor that showed how far Putin was willing to go to protect Maduro. What he sent there was a punished general, a high-ranking Russian general, Oleg Makarevich, who was sent to Venezuela after the loss against Ukraine. Makarevich was responsible for the area. He reportedly requested permission from the Kremlin several times to leave the country, fearing possible actions by the United States or even detention, but Moscow denied all his attempts to leave. Makarevich commanded about 120 Russian mercenaries in Caracas, whose role was to train Venezuelan forces in drone operations and troop instruction, as well as to carry out intelligence activities. Local authorities say the Americans launched the attack based on this scenario. The United States Cyber Command had deployed dormant malware in the national power grid and military communication systems. They were just waiting for the exact moment to shut down Venezuela's strategic points. Trump's order to begin with came in the most unusual way. Don't worry, be happy. Maduro was dancing, imitating Donald Trump and mocking the United States. Still in December, when the American president watched the video, he got irritated. He ordered the attack to be carried out as soon as the weather conditions were favorable. At 1:42 in the morning, a coordinated cyber attack took down the power grid in Caracas, plunging the capital into darkness. Simultaneously, an electronic attack composed of EA-18G Growlers launched a barrage of broadband jamming against the surveillance radars. The Growlers flooded the enemy radar frequencies with electromagnetic noise. The operators' screens were filled with static and false targets. They knew there was something there, but they couldn't lock on. To try to overcome the noise, the operators activated a mode in which the equipment focused all its power into a narrow beam, increasing the transmission power to the maximum. That's exactly what the Americans wanted. It was like turning on a flashlight in the dark. By emitting at maximum power, the radar turned into a giant beacon in the electromagnetic spectrum, making it an easy target. Air-to-ground missile, 88E missiles and Tomahawk cruise missiles left their launchers, crossing the Venezuelan skies. After the initial flight, they descended to take advantage of the geography and the vulnerabilities of the S-300VM. The Tomahawks and assault helicopters flew close to the ground, staying below the detection horizon until they were seconds from the target, denying the necessary reaction time for a firing solution. Tactical analysis suggests that the United States employed a surgical air defense suppression strategy, using the passive geolocation capability of the EF-85 fighters. The emissions from the Russian radars were triangulated and attacked with precision munitions. They hit the radar emitters of the S-300VM and the Buk M2E. It remained to be seen whether the Venezuelan Air Force would take off. The problem was that there was nothing but shadows and legends to defend the country's skies. The Venezuelan Air Force, once the most powerful in the region, entered 2026 as a shadow of its former self. Venezuela operated a fleet of F-16s acquired in 1983, but after United States embargoes and a lack of spare parts, many were cannibalized to keep only a few operational. In the early 2000s, Hugo Chavez acquired 24 Sukhoi Su-30 Mk, 2 fighter jets. Of those, no more than 8 were active. After Venezuela's economic crises and the war in Ukraine, a time when the Russians drastically reduced logistical support to foreign clients. To focus on a conflict in which they would be trapped for years, the F-35s did their part, flying without being detected by Chinese radars, as was so often promised. The supposed ability of the JY-27A to detect the F-35 was nullified by sophisticated electronic countermeasures, although the F-35 can defend itself. The mission of ensuring that no enemy aircraft interfered was assigned to the F-22 Raptor, a plane designed to take down other fighters. 12 of them flew prepared for this, but they didn't need to take action. They suffered mockery over their development problems, but they got their revenge. Bombs like the Guided Bomb Unit, 32 Joint Direct Attack Munition guided by Global Positioning System and Inertial Navigation System traveled smoothly, immune to air defenses, falling on aircraft and runways, creating craters that prevented anything not already destroyed from taking off. In the hangars of Luis del Valle Garcia and El Libertador air bases, ironically due to the war of F-16s, they had seen how the technology of their former instructors had evolved, now destroying planes that, if they had been upgraded, might not be just scrap on a smoke-covered runway. After that, operations over the skies of Caracas became even easier. Satellite images confirmed the destruction of hangars and critical infrastructure in La Guaira and at Generalissimo Francisco de Miranda Air Base, rendering useless any aircraft that might have survived the first wave. Taking advantage of the chaos and the darkness, multi-mission helicopter, 47G Chinook, and multi-mission helicopter, 60M Black Hawk helicopters from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment Naughty Stalkers, carried out a daring infiltration flying less than 30 meters above the Caribbean Sea. To avoid any residual radar detection, the assault force used the mountainous terrain north of Caracas. Initially, the helicopters were carrying dozens of Army Delta Force commandos. They advanced undetected, but as they approached Maduro's hideout, they came under enemy fire and returned fire. The first assault helicopter, a large twin-engine multi-mission helicopter, 47 Chinook, was hit but remained airborne. The leader of the formation, who also planned the mission and was piloting the aircraft, was wounded 3 times in the leg. According to American officials, he stayed on course while the damaged helicopter struggled to remain airborne and complete the infiltration. For a moment, the success of Operation Absolute Resolve was at risk. There was concern the Chinook might crash over the hostile city, repeating the trauma of the 1993 helicopter shoot-down in Mogadiscio. The crash of that Black Hawk in Somalia certainly crossed the minds of some Delta Force operators, especially since the unit had taken part in that historic mission. The helicopters could have been challenged by the 5,000 portable air defense systems that Maduro claimed to possess, but there was only one recorded shot. The missile from the Russian Igla system tore through the night searching for the helicopter, but it only found a hill ahead. The American response was swift, eliminating that isolated resistance. These fighters were likely among the 24 to 40 Venezuelan soldiers who died during the operation. At 2:01 ante meridiem in Caracas, Special Forces operators landed, including those from the damaged Chinook. There was resistance on the ground. Heavy gunfire reported at Fort Ciuna. Maduro's personal guard, mostly made up of Cuban intelligence agents, fought to protect the president. Delta Force faced the challenge of overcoming this defense. Maduro didn't trust his own countrymen for his security, and he was right about that. The Cubans, ideologically motivated, put up resistance in a fierce shootout inside the residence where the Venezuelan leader was hiding. They had the advantage of the defensive position, but the Americans had intensive close-quarters battle training and an even greater advantage, experience. Delta Force wasn't just a group of soldiers who had trained in a mock-up of the location, they were battle-hardened veterans. Africa and the Middle East were part of their routine. They had stormed places taken by Islamic State of Iraq and Syria and other hostile forces. There, they met the Cubans Maduro trusted. Venezuela, with its vast oil reserves, started offering the product to Cuba at subsidized prices in exchange for doctors. And, of course, soldiers like those. It was said that among Maduro's protection were the black wasps, elite special forces of the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces. Maduro trusted their training, supervised by specialists in Putin's elite force. Furthermore, Maduro was aware of the selection of loyal men and the Cuban experience in other conflicts. However, facing Delta Force was a challenge of a different magnitude. After an intense confrontation with the Cuban security, the soldiers blew up the door to the room, capturing Maduro and his wife as they tried to escape to a reinforced room. The bodies of 32 Cubans were left behind, and only 7 Americans returned wounded. For the helicopters, a new wave of aircraft evacuated the commandos and the prisoners under enemy fire. At 4:30 in the morning, the aircraft were already over the sea, and later, Maduro and his wife were handed over to the authorities aboard the United States ship. Iwo Jima, the lead pilot of the Night Stalkers, was seriously injured but recovered in a hospital in Texas. Just like another serviceman, 5 other soldiers were treated and released. The authorities described the pilot's actions as heroic. The same, however, cannot be said of the Venezuelan armed forces and some of their politicians. There is consistent evidence that the rapid disintegration of the Bolivarian National Armed Forces was not only the result of the adversary's military superiority, but also of a breakdown of loyalty in the upper ranks. During the decisive moments of the offensive, the then Minister of Defense, Vladimir Padrino Lopez, as well as other central leaders of the regime, including Diosdado Cabello, adopted a complete silence. In the nation, experts assessed that sectors of the armed forces, realizing the inevitability of the government's collapse, or already influenced by foreign intelligence actions, ordered the air defense systems to remain inactive or promoted their early neutralization. This deliberate omission would have been decisive for the success of the operation. At the same time, the low morale of the troops, worn down by years of economic crisis, shortage of supplies, and structural corruption, accelerated. Defeated, many soldiers, especially conscripts, abandoned their positions or offered minimal resistance, in stark contrast to the stricter and more combative stance of the Cuban agents responsible for the regime's security. After the United States military operation, which resulted in the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, former Vice President Delcy Rodriguez was sworn in as interim president of Venezuela. As predicted, it is confirmed. The lead pilot has been defeated. In 2017, when he was Minister of Foreign Affairs, he tried to attract American support and investments. Amid the Venezuelan economic crisis, he even arranged a $500,000 donation from the Venezuelan END Citrico for Donald Trump's inauguration ceremony, in addition to cultivating ties with lobbyists and business circles in the United States. Despite Lopez having been a central figure in Maduro's government and the target of international sanctions for his role in political repression, the Trump administration chose to support her as a figure capable of maintaining immediate stability in the country instead of backing the traditional Venezuelan opposition. This represented a setback for the opposition led by Maria Corina Machado. Trump stated that Machado would not have enough support or respect within Venezuela to lead the country after Maduro's fall. White House advisors and analysts, including members of the CIA and the State Department, influenced this decision, arguing that supporting the opposition could further destabilize the nation and require a continued United States military presence. In the end, Maduro danced and danced, but he and his wife didn't realize that the music had changed and that others were already dancing to a different rhythm. Celia Flores held a lot of power in Venezuela. She was taken along with her husband, not out of love or care, but because leaving her behind would risk keeping free someone with political connections and power, perhaps even greater than Maduro himself. In the end, Trump celebrated the fact that Venezuela would send 50 million barrels of oil to the United States. The United States Department of Justice removed from the new criminal charge the allegation that Nicolás Maduro was the leader of the so-called Cartel de los Soles, an organization allegedly responsible for drug trafficking. In previous charges, since 2020, the Americans claimed that the group operated as a cartel under the direct command of Maduro, sending large quantities of cocaine to the United States, which served as the basis for sanctions and the designation as a terrorist organization. According to analysts, by abandoning the thesis of a single, centralized and hierarchical cartel, this position has changed. The Department of Justice is technically strengthening the accusation, reducing legal weaknesses that could be exploited in court, since the previous formulation required difficult proof of direct command. With this, the evidentiary focus shifts to more consistent elements such as state collusion, the institutional facilitation of drug trafficking, and the existence of a widespread system of corruption among military personnel and high-ranking authorities. The show would go on. There was a Russian general still imprisoned in Venezuela, forgotten, proving that every great power has the habit of forgetting its allies. Oleg Makarovich would still make requests to leave, but in January 2006 he was still in Venezuela. Maduro's former allies inside the country made promise after promise, but they were insignificant gestures for a man imprisoned in another country. The show went on. Maduro was an individual who, along with his wife, killed and imprisoned opponents and kept allies connected to drug trafficking. However, none of that was the real reason for his downfall. Maduro was just another dictator who misstepped in the dance of geopolitics and had the audacity to stomp on oil, inviting Russians and Chinese to the party, when in fact it was Trump who wanted to choose the music.